Thank you very much, Jared, and such a thrill to be here and to be with you in electronic spirit. Um, and I will give my presentation, which I've written out, of course, and thought. Um, in the midst of it, I'll also tell you a story, a true story, which illustrates some of the points being made. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterward. So I've chosen the theme of soul education and progressive awakenings. It's an intriguing theme. And I've gleaned what I have from the teachings of Theosophia, especially as articulated by H.P. Blavatsky, William Quan Judge, and Shri Raghavan Iyer. And so I'll have the privilege of sharing some thoughts with you. And then we'll have opportunity to have kind of intellectual engagement about the topic and the theme. So to begin, the wisdom teachings of Theosophy state that the transcendent divine is within, without, and above both man and nature. Divinity illuminates and energizes every being and every object in every conceivable world. Furthermore, sages and seers of every culture and every epoch have mastered this divine wisdom, and most importantly, continually find fresh means and modalities of disseminating and embodying their profound knowledge for the benefit of mankind. These enlightened beings all affirm, in more or less veiled language, the immortality of the human soul. Even more, they intimate that each human soul is on a vast pilgrimage to realize his oneness with divinity. This spiritual quest back to God is regulated by divine law or karma and takes innumerable lifetimes to accomplish. If this is so, then it's only reasonable to assume that all true education or deep learning may be viewed as a series of progressive awakenings to the divine within us all. These inner revelations or soul recollections, when they occur, creatively fuse wisdom, love, and right action. How truly exquisite we potentially are. Is it any wonder then that Shakespeare's Hamlet offers this description of human nature at its best? To quote Shakespeare, "What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason! How infinite in faculty! In form and moving, how express and admirable! In action, how like an angel! In apprehension, how like a god!" Unquote. Given this exalted and highly inspiring conception of man, we can easily appreciate the vital importance of soul awakening, of throwing off mental slumber, of waking up from intellectual stupor, and of freeing ourselves from the tyranny of personal feelings. In order to cease from what Socrates called mental and moral sleepwalking, we must dare to pose certain questions to ourselves and to each other as well. It's important to question and to challenge our thinking and that of like-minded seekers too. Raising questions is a divine art. It is the signature of our monastic divinity and the alchemical agent for genuine education. Why? Because spiritual education is true educare. It draws out and brings forth our innate wisdom. But it begins with intelligent questions and continues with clear, rational, and responsible thinking. Let us first pose the following Socratic question. How much does the overarching vision of modern education prepare us for genuine soul awakenings, or for what Plato called anamnesis, soul recollection? Before answering this question, however, it might be helpful to briefly outline the general stages of, quote, individual growth, unquote, from conception to young adulthood at this particular point in Kali Yuga. It is taught in Theosophia that a ray of lower manas enters the fetus at 7 months of age. This is the beginning of education. The mother's emotional and cognitive condition powerfully affect the fetus. Her calmness and the ideas she entertains help shapes the child's astral and psychic bodies. For this reason, if for no other, the solicitous care of the father is crucial during this time of invisible gestation. The father and the mother-to-be must be solemn yet proud co-workers with nature. Shall? As we know, young children are often unconscious reminders of long-forgotten golden ages, and simultaneously they are harbingers of golden ages yet to come. At birth, the consciousness of a baby is bathed in the translucent light of the Atman. Its whole being is pure, radiant, and wholesome. Its unpremeditated gestures and irrepressible laughter are delightfully contagious, and equally, its growing pains and inescapable sorrows immediately evoke our sympathies and focused care. At some point in early childhood, a child's desire to learn and to know is born. Its curious, questioning mind, the reflection of its innate divinity, is aroused. And to the child mentally waking up to the magic of questioning and learning, the world has just begun. The whole mysterious cosmos is a new creation waiting to be discovered afresh. For this reason, everything to the child's inquiring mind is original. Everything is being revealed for the first time in history, and everything is sparkling with promising possibilities. In addition to this golden age freshness, a child's imagination is virginal, and its receptivity to learning from its parent and elders is absolute. The young child trusts its elders when they answer its questions, and due to the psychic bond with its parents, a child learns as much by its assimilation of its parents' mentality as it does by the initial exercise of its own unfolding powers of intellection and imagination. If its parents are wise, they will foster an early schooling of the heart as well as of the head. And of course, the primary teacher of heart qualities at this point, yes. And of course, the primary teacher of heart qualities at this stage is not books so much as it is the shaping influences that emanate from human beings who occupy the young child's circumscribed social world, whether those influences are for good or for ill. For this reason, parents and devoted family members need to see themselves as vigilant stewards of the young child's moral character. Beyond the quiet moral example of its parents and its preliminary intellectual unfoldment, children love to listen to stories, legends, and historical instances of extraordinary courage, of good conquering evil, and of the ennobling power of self-sacrifice. Fortunately, young children do not yet suffer from the malady of separating moral inspiration from courageous action, expansive theory from clarifying practice, moral ideals from fearless embodiment. That comes later in junior high school. Instead, young children intuitively understand fairy tales, legends, and stories that illustrate all the ways in which selfish people eventually come to ruin, while the unselfish find satisfaction in conquering their fears and desires for the sake of the human family. When the immortal individuality illumines the embodied manas of a child around the age of 7, something mysterious and magical happens. There is a reenactment of the collective lighting up of manas at the individual level. An antaskarna drawbridge is sacrificially extended from the immortal mind to the embodied manas. A quantum shift in self-awareness has occurred, and the potential of lower manas to rise above its natural self-centeredness is made possible. The child becomes increasingly aware of itself as an independent, rational, and moral agent who can think, feel, speak, and act independently of parents, relatives, and peers. The child progressively realizes that it is a self-aware, effect-causing person within an ever-expanding social world. In a word, the child begins to emerge from its cocoon of solipsism, of natural self-centeredness. It gains not only the power of intellectual abstraction and of critical appraisal, but most significantly, a feeling of identity-expanding empathy for the needy, a felt sense of being part of a transcendent global community. The seeds of altruism begin to germinate and are fertilized and nurtured by reflection on humane and eternal truths. Furthermore, in the prepubescent, self-aware young person, the karma principle is being unconsciously diversified through the awakening of wishes, appetites, and fantasies, which it needs to satisfy and control appropriately. This is why parents need to help the preteen cultivate kindness, self-discipline, empathy for the suffering of others, forgiveness of wrongs, and a feeling of responsibility for the consequences of its increasingly self-determined actions. Kama must be contained and tamed, while a feeling of altruism and cooperative fellowship must be encouraged. When puberty comes and the creative urges are aroused, perceptive theosophical parents are most grateful that the higher manas existentially connected itself with the lower manas years before the advent of adolescence. To be sure, puberty is usually unsettling in many respects, and unless the teenager has grown up in a culture where self-control, responsibility, and the ideal of monogamy are still marginally upheld, for example, Hindu India, it can be very difficult to channel inner karmic forces in wholesome, non-sexual ways. Furthermore, the period of teenagerhood is often a time or period of monastic rebellion. Sorry, Michelle, it's gone off again. Yeah. By virtue of entering into the turbulent ocean of peer pressures and modern competitive education, the teenager, becoming adult, begins questioning the beliefs and practices of its parents, its culture, and institutional authority in general. Wise indeed is the educational system and political culture that can help young adults find creative outlets for creative thinking and wholesome self-expression without stifling their revolutionary spirit. Given all this, what can we say about modern education as it generally exists? On the Great Seal of the University of California is imprinted the motto, Fiat Lux. This translates into the compelling Old Testament invocation, let there be light. In modern secular terms, light is rendered as truth. Modern Western education then is committed to the overarching pursuit of truth. It is also devoted to the cultural transmission of such discovered truth, called knowledge, from one generation to another, and that knowledge is communicated from teacher to students in a variety of institutional modes. However, it is important to note that truth in the context of modern secular education has been conflated to quantifiable truth and statistical trends that yield some form of behavioral predictability. Modern education primarily pursues, discovers, and transmits quantum knowledge through highly sophisticated intellectual means, through rational analysis, through conceptual system building, through the rules of logic, through controlled scientific experimentation. Modern education is really all about developing the mind, or more narrowly, the physical intellect. It is about the fullest possible intellectual development and the strengthening of memory. It is not principally concerned with cultivating emotional maturity or distinguishing between wholesome and harmful desires, or about skill in interaction, nor is it about training the rational moral will to do what is right and good for each and all. There's no direct appeal to the moral imagination because value teaching is not permissible except in sectarian religious schools. Thus, we find that the modern educated person is often highly knowledgeable, factually informed, and skilled in reasoning within the compass of his specialized field of study. While he might extend his discipline's current parameters, he rarely questions its implicit assumptions about human nature. For that reason, the quality of a student's personhood, his character, and his ability to disinterestedly contribute to the uplift of his community is often ignored and sadly lacking. Is it any wonder, then, that we witness successive generations of brilliant, technologically savvy youth who are nonetheless culturally adrift, weak-willed, and quite understandably in search of a deeper purpose in life, one beyond mere success, social status, fame, or the accumulation of wealth? Soul education, by contrast with modern secular and most religious education, plumbs the depths of fiat lux and claims that its core meaning is let there be wisdom. In fact, there is a basis for this interpretation of lux in the Christian Bible, and even in the Great Seal of the University of California itself, which seal includes an artistic rendering of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, sprung from the forehead of Zeus. In most wisdom teachings, wisdom is conceived of as all-inclusive. It includes the moral as well as the intellectual and the psychological. That's why in ancient India, your guru or teacher was not merely an instructor. You went and lived with your teacher and his family. Your teacher exemplified and breathed fresh life and meaning into the traditional teachings that he passed on from untold millennia in the past. Looked at in this way, the activation of wisdom, of soul knowledge, releases the profoundest possible insights into a harmonic relationship with God, nature, and man. Furthermore, wisdom is not only cognitively illuminating, but expansively compassionate and morally kinetic. If this is true, then soul education is potentially far more existentially enriching and socially transformative than modern secular education could ever be. Wisdom, at the human level, is purest insight into what is right in any and every moral situation. It is knowing what to say, when to say it, to whom to say it, and how to say it. It is creative and dynamic in expression. Thus, wisdom, when it suffuses the mind, can alchemize, purify, and enlighten every relationship because it resonates with divine compassion and intelligence. Now, this reference to wisdom and alchemy is really quite interesting to the student of wisdom religion. Why? Because the student, committed to progressively scaling the forbidding homologies of wisdom, must first and foremost make a sacred resolve, an unconditional pledge to live for the universal enlightenment of the human race. Such an impersonal spiritual pledge purifies and strengthens the mind. Spiritual vow-taking is mirrored in the Hippocratic oath of the physician, the pledge of loyalty taken by the elected official when assuming public office, the God-inspired vows taken by religious novitiates, and other similar altruistic promises. The spiritual pledge to pursue wisdom is inseparable from one's devotion to the Guru Parampara. One must cultivate the spirit of reverence, a profound adoration for those beings whose aid is crucial to self-mastery and to right action. Motive is vital to the wisdom quest and to wisdom in action. The ardent soul learner must therefore consecrate all wisdom discoveries to humanity and to the society of sages. Wisdom compassion without consecration and reverence for teachers is impossible. And the very heart of Theosophia rests upon the reality of the existence of self-conscious, omniscient beings. We call such beings in their divine society the brotherhood of bodhisattvas. Without adoration of the divine nature of these self-illuminated sages, one cannot activate the alchemical element, the soma chemistry that precipitates the earnest descent or the earned descent of wisdom into the welcoming mind of the disciple. At its very core, soul education, like wisdom, is holistic. What does this mean? It means that it involves enlightening the whole person. It involves uplifting the whole of society too. It leaves nothing out of the algebra of its learning equations. If so, then soul education necessarily involves training and integrating the head, the heart, and the hand, a key feature of Gandhi's educational program. Among other things, soul education means clarifying our conceptual understanding of moral terms, awakening our deepest feelings and intuition, and harvesting the lessons embedded in our suffering. In a word, soul education shifts the focus as well as the locus from knowledge of the mind in isolation to the all-inclusive soul. What does this mean? What is the soul? The soul is a metaphysical unit, a differentiated unity. It is, if you will, a ray of God's intelligence. As Ralph Waldo Emerson states, I am born into the great, the universal mind. As a ray of God's cosmic mind, the human soul is necessarily immortal, incandescent, self-moving, omniscient, and all-compassionate. It is the heart center and source of infinite, penetrating insights into God, nature, and man. The human soul is the origin in man and nature of perpetual creativity, self-sustaining preservation, and spiritual self-regeneration. Furthermore, the immortal soul is both transcendent and immanent. It is transcendent because it is unborn. It is not conditioned by space-time, by the brain-mind, or by ordinary consciousness. Yet, it is simultaneously immanent or reflected in space-time, in the brain-mind, and in ordinary consciousness. The inspirited mind is what allows us to aspire to the soul's full, exalted condition of omniscience and magnanimity. In light of all this, it seems evident that soul education naturally encourages higher aspirations, aspirations toward the universal, the principled, and the highest values. It encourages upward mental movement, what Plato described as the ardent turning of the soul toward the divine. It nurtures spiritual and moral ideals which unify and heal one's mind, one's relationship, and one's culture. It is concerned with inner ascent in order to gain spiritual altitude and an encompassing perspective on life. Furthermore, soul learning is not limited to any particular stage of life. It includes our sunset years, as well as the halcyon years of early youth. It is not confined to any particular location, such as a classroom. Indeed, it can and does occur at home, at church, at work, at play, in the theater, and in all the informal social contexts of life. While anyone can be a teacher, only consummate learners can be master teachers. They alone communicate effectively because they feel at one with their students. Take, for example, the true story told to me by an eminent cultural anthropologist, Paul Bohannon. Many years ago, I was in charge of a tutorial center at the University of California in Santa Barbara. I had an occasion in which I met this very remarkable cultural anthropologist, Paul Bohannon. And since he himself had been a Rhodes Scholar from America to Oxford and loved the tutorial method, we ended up having quite a lot in common. So we had a wonderful conversation. But during the course of the conversation, he said to me, "You know, it's so interesting how we can learn." He said, "I'll share with you a true story. I haven't told it to many people, but I feel that we understand each other." So he said, when he was at Oxford, he'd majored in languages, but he decided to become a cultural anthropologist. He then went to Nigeria and spoke to the chief of the Tiv people. And he convinced the chief that he could live with the Tiv people for 2 years, but he would never interfere with anything to do with what the chief did or any of the people did. He would simply be an observer. Now, over the course of 2 years, he said, he ended up having many conversations privately with the chief, whom he greatly respected. One night, he said, he came to the chief's hut to say goodbye because he was returning to Oxford the next day. When he entered the hut, he noticed something unusual. The chief looked depressed. The chief always had to maintain a certain demeanor whenever he was in public whatsoever. And even though Bohannon had had several conversations with him over 2 years, he'd never seen the chief looking dismayed and depressed. So he said, I sat down across from him, but I didn't speak. You don't speak first when you're in the presence of a chief. So I was quiet and I waited. Finally, he looked up at me and he smiled. And he said, you know, Bohannon, I have made a terrible mistake. Bohannon said he was shocked, but quiet. He didn't want to ask him about his mistake. That was up to the chief. Finally, the chief said, and my mistake, Bohannon, is that I have fallen in love with one of my 17 wives. Now, in the context of the Tiv society, the chief was required to marry women from different sub-tribes. That was a symbol of keeping it unified and to have children by all these women. But he had to be impartial. He had to observe impartiality in relation to all of his wives. But he said to Bohannan, he said, if you think for one moment, Bohannan, that despite my best efforts, my affection for this particular wife will go unnoticed, then you haven't learned anything from us. I'm watched carefully. Every gesture I make is watched. I'm continually on duty. And so now I have a problem. How am I going to keep others from seeing my special affection for this particular young wife? And Bohannan said, I sympathize with this problem. However, the chief looked at me and said, you know, you're leaving tomorrow, and I wish to pass on to you something of the wisdom of our people. And Bohannan said, I was thrilled. I said, yes, absolutely. And he said, in our conversations, I've come to understand something about your people. You don't understand true intimacy. Bohannan said, I was quiet. Might I ask what you mean? Of course. You think intimacy, from what I gather, is physical. We know better. To the simple husband and wife in our tribe, we know that intimacy has to do with trust, has to do with understanding, has to do with sympathy, has to do with affection, has to do with patience. It's earned, and it doesn't always happen. Sometimes, after years, true intimacy, true friendship dawns. And when that happens, they don't need to say much. They understand each other. A gesture, a look, a smile, a frown, a sweet touch at the right time, an embrace to dispel grief. All these things come natural. So that true intimacy is deep. And when it comes, it's such a jewel that we bask in it. So I suggest to you, when you go back to your people, you pass on the wisdom of the Tim people, that intimacy is highly desirable, but it has to do with qualities of the heart. And Bohannan said, I thanked him and I left. And now that I'm here at University of California, Santa Barbara on an honorarium, guess what I'm working on, Jim? I'm writing a book on marriage and divorce. And I'm passing on the wisdom that I learned from this chief, who taught me something very beautiful and very true. Now, as we can see, a wisdom realizing moment can take place not only in the classroom, but inside straw huts, under the protective canopy of trees, or in sparse Zen-like gardens. And teachers of wisdom can come in many forms and guises. And of course, soul learning can also occur in treasured moments of serene solitude when we meditate on universal ideas, and most especially contemplate the supernal virtues of bodhisattvas and the sacrifices of their accredited agents in Mialba. The Chinese sage Lao Tzu taught that in its initial stages, soul education is about therapeutic subtraction more than about luminous addition. We begin in spiritual ignorance, but can, through personal effort over lifetimes, end up in a sublime state of realized wisdom. But to progressively realize our innate wisdom, we must first unlearn. We must progressively strip away our bad habits and simultaneously cure the mind of its selfish afflictions, its gross misconceptions, its inverted perceptions, its romanticized illusions, its self-destructive habits, its false values, and above all, its grasping, aggrandizing ego. This cleaning up, clearing up, and unselfing the mind through letting go of our identity-limiting attachments creates mental spaces for the light of the monad to germinate seeds of wisdom. We might say that the purification of the mind, or unlearning, is necessarily painful, but vital for spiritual, intellectual, and moral growth to occur. Soul learning recognizes that at every stage of life, the child state is essential to learning, to waking up. To the genuine adult seeker and the young at heart, the world of knowledge is forever new. It is never settled. It is ever and forever points to golden age possibilities, even within the darkest of times. As we have seen, modern education is focused almost exclusively on intellectual development. Furthermore, it is based on the false theory that the mind is a blank state on which God, nature, and society write their respective scripts, and which we unconsciously act out. Modern education does not embrace the theory of innate ideas or of innate wisdom. Its stimulus for growth is primarily based on competition between students, and its educational success measured by grades and test scores. Ultimately, the competitive urge and the anxiety-driven fixation on grades are corrosives to the indwelling psyche. Unfortunately, contemporary education egregiously disconnects the pursuit of knowledge from the intelligent and intrepid embodiment of moral values, which sanctify that knowledge and almost always uplifts and regenerates society. Soul education is quintessentially noetic. It is the creative marriage of intuitive revelation and acquired experience, of spiritual illumination and thoughtful, self-determined action. Intellectually speaking, soul education, or noetic learning, emphasizes questions over answers. It stresses critical thinking over mere memorization. It cultivates moral imagination as well as logical reasoning. It studies heroes and heroines to aid students in their efforts to train the creative moral will and to discipline the passions. In effect, soul education is a means of spiritualizing the intellect, such that it becomes warm, expansive, and multifaceted, and lit up by the overbrooding spirit. Soul education is open to the teaching power of dreams, as well as to the compelling conclusions of logic. Like Shakespeare, soul education is open to learning not only from books, but from brooks and stones, and from little children and sages too. Furthermore, soul education is patient, withholding contradictory views because it has faith in the penetrating and synthesizing power of pure intuition. Finally, soul education includes self-study in the light of high moral and spiritual ideals, as well as the study of text. Self-knowledge is ultimately the key to wisdom and is superior to any book knowledge, including the study of religious text. If all this is true, then what might be involved in reforming modern education and making it more susceptible to noetic learning and the lifelong quest for divine wisdom? What is needed is the recovery of what was present in parent-child teaching, but is often lost in the early years of formal education. Love, trust, and reverence for the spiritually heroic. All three heart qualities point to the need to cultivate the alpha heart and not just the alpha intellect. A self-replenishing love for learning is essential. Such love leads to genuine questions and the humility to listen to answers. To sustain and renew learning is possible when one increasingly appreciates the hard-earned knowledge of one's teachers and of those who dedicate their lives to using that knowledge in the service of others. Trust is likewise pivotal. How can one learn if one does not trust one's teachers, which includes parents, friends, and even strangers? How can one merit knowledge if one does not have confidence in one's capacity to learn? And finally, how can one learn the deepest knowledge if one does not possess reverence? We should revere not only God, but man, not only man, but nature. Why? Because God is everywhere, both inside and outside of man and nature. If the divine is omnipresent, then all learning of whatever kind is sacred, is consecrate. We begin to learn, to wake up, when we revere spiritual teachers and extend that reverence to all those who are full of goodness and light. Such reverence ultimately results in the descent of wisdom into the alert, clear mind and the heroic heart. In closing, it is important to recognize that our lodges may become spiritual centers, disguised temples which radiate spiritual influences to those who attend, to receptive souls in deep sleep, and to those across the globe who dedicate their lives and their fortunes to the service of their suffering fellow man. When deserved, the sublime brotherhood of bodhisattvas can use us to uplift the whole of humanity, born and yet to be born. Their existential and glorious presence should lead us to join chorus with sweet Miranda in Shakespeare's Tempest, when she enthusiastically and innocently declares, "How beauteous mankind is! Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." Thank you, and I will now be happy to discuss with you any questions you might have, whether on things I discussed or things I left out and you'd like to include. And remind me, by the way, if I have a chance to tell you a little story about Socrates and learning.
Did you want to start by telling us about Socrates and learning?
Well, I suppose I could. This, if you look at Platonic dialogues, they're so rich in what it means for the soul-infused reason, what he called nous, to be such an incredible learner. And in the dialogue on the banquet, Socrates admits that he learned about love from a remarkable priestess who lived up in the hills above Athens. And her name was Diotima. And she conveyed to him something of the deep mysteries of love, which have to do with the relationship between the gods and mankind. Love is an interpreter between the gods and man. It's a sublime language of unity and connection. So she explained all this to him, and he went ahead and they had a wonderful discussion at the banquet. Well, however, afterwards, what happened was this young man came up to Socrates and said, "Socrates, you are so wise. I just want to ask you a question, and it's a very important question to me." And Socrates said, "Well, my good young man, go ahead. By all means, ask me your question." He said, "Well, here's my question. My question is, should I marry or should I not marry? That's my question." The story goes that Socrates was quiet for quite a while, said nothing. Then he looked at the young man who was patiently waiting, smiled at the young man, and said, "My good young man, all I can tell you is this: whether you marry or do not marry, you will suffer." There's humor and there's truth. Questions? Such a
Jim, Jim, you just glitched when you were making the final point. Could you just make the final point of that dialogue again?
The final, I'm sorry, the final what?
The final part of that dialogue, it just cut out when you were saying it.
Oh, you didn't hear the punchline?
No, sorry.
What a sober, grim group. What Socrates said, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, what Socrates said, do you know what the question was, right? Should I marry or should I not marry? That was the young man's question.
Yes.
It was a serious question. And Socrates was quiet for quite a while. And he said nothing. And finally, he looked at the young man and smiled and said to him, "My good young man, whichever way you choose, to marry or not to marry, you will surely suffer." Now normal.
Now we got it. We weren't actually the tough audience. We just didn't hear the punchline. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so I'm happy to take some questions from the floor if anyone wants to pop their hand up. Because I've got the microphone, I might jump in with the first one, Jim, if that's okay. You mentioned in your presentation, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yes. You mentioned in your presentation the concept of unlearning on the soul's journey of education. And just reflecting on Australian culture and our modern society, we've gone the way of Europe and we're becoming more secularized, so that we don't have as much conversation about God in schools as what perhaps I was brought up with. There's chaplaincy in schools, but it's not, it's an elected sort of thing in the state school system. And by and large, I think that my observation would be the churches have lost their influence in the moral sphere with our society compared to what it was, 30 years ago. But at the same time, there's a freedom for people to explore soul education without some of the trappings of dogmatics and exoteric teaching. So I'm just wondering if you've got any comments about the role of the theosophical movement at this time for us, with your background in education.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. In high school in our country, you can't engage in what's called value teaching, because they see that as a religious. When you bring in values, you are bringing in religion, and there's this protective wall between religion and education. But once you cross the threshold of high school and go into college, then that totally changes. You can discuss values and moral principles and so forth and so on as you wish. The Dalai Lama has tried to deal with this in his own way. His claim is that if Buddhists were allowed to teach classes in America and in Europe, it would revolutionize the understanding of education, because the Buddhists don't see moral principles, ideals, and values as being religious. They see that as being human. And therefore, that's why the reference was, once you get into public school, it is so secularized, which, and the good side of it is, it has a lot of open texture. It has a kind of a willingness to explore any facet of knowledge, but you can't bring in something that has to do with anything to do with, quote, being moral, having to do with the human will. It's really bizarre. But the point is, when I was teaching at the college, um, it was astounding how open students were to hearing about right, honorable, just, terms that we consider to be ethical, even metaphysical. And when I gave them instances from history of people who were morally fearless and courageous and self-sacrificing, they loved it. And when I gave them a philosophy, like I would give them something from Pythagoras or something from Platonic philosophy or from Plotinus or from St. Thomas Aquinas, when I brought in the ethical and related it to daily life, many of these students who grew up in very simple families, they just loved it. And they smiled, and they wanted to hear moral problems, moral dilemmas. I would often give them critical choices. Okay, you're a doctor, you're going out, you're driving down a road, you're out where your cell phone doesn't work. You drive along and you see this, suddenly there's been an accident, and there are people in the car and they're hurt and they're in the side of the road. As a doctor and a physician, you have the knowledge to help them, possibly save their lives. But in your particular state, there is no Good Samaritan law. So if you stop and they decide later on to sue you, you're going to be vulnerable and your malpractice costs are going to go up and all of this. So the doctor decides, instead of stopping to help, she decides to drive on. The question is, was that the right choice? The best choice? The only choice? Was that selfish? Practical? How do we look at it? They would love things like that. This could be done in junior high and early on. They've shown in studies, for example, critical thinking, that you can begin critical thinking in kindergarten. And in time, children bring together different elements and weave their own philosophy. When you read what HBB says in the Key to Theosophy on Education, she talks about free thought and critical thinking. Critical not meaning critical in the sense of being negative and finding fault, but critical in the sense of vital thinking, thinking about things that are vital to a healthy, wholesome life in a community, and bringing in the alpha heart, bringing in examples of kindness, thoughtfulness, generosity. Let them hear these things. One of the best teachers I ever saw was a fourth grade teacher, and she had all over the wall in her classroom quotes from Socrates, from Shelley, from Keats, and they were all emphasizing the heroic. People should be fearless, because the biggest problem and the greatest, you might call it corrosive, of the modern mind is fear. Fear when COVID comes, fear with this, fear with that. In the 50s, it was nuclear weapons. I mean, so many things. Fear of global warming. Our knowledge is our enemy. We don't have the courage to see that individual micro actions by individuals on behalf of some principle, some good, some ideal, some parapolitical principle, your own individual acts, whether other people do it or not, that means you're becoming a true individual, theosophically speaking. You're invoking the intelligence and light of the divine fearlessly. You cooperate with the best in yourself. And as Krishna teaches, you don't count consequences, but you hope for the best. So we should point in grammar school and high school in particular, and when it's done, they love it. Point to people in history in every culture, doesn't matter the culture, people who take a stand on behalf of the good that's larger than themselves, that doesn't come about in their lifetime even, working for the future way beyond yourself, way beyond your own children, way beyond your grandchildren. You know, there's that famous tribe, I think it was in the Northwest, that when they come together in council, they do what we should all do at every meeting of a lodge: consecrate the occasion by pausing, quietly putting one's mind and heart together on the existence of sages and seers across the globe who are at that very moment engaged in uplifting human thought and human feeling and human fellowship all over the globe. So to do that is to consecrate and to make it possible to be aware of the incredible fearlessness and love of people who we find exemplary. And it can be contagious. When that's given to young people, they respond. They don't care about the subtle veil between religion and the secular, because human values bridge the two. What is the bridge between religion and the secular? The sacred in the secular is a commitment to values that go beyond your own lifetime, that have to do with the health and wholesome uplift of everyone, going out in concentric circles from one's little circle of obligations, spreading out across the globe. So to teach people that they have the power in themselves, like the Dalai Lama said when he was asked, how are you going to convert the Chinese communists? He said it's simple, one Chinese communist at a time. He didn't have any big ambitions about converting the whole of China to becoming Buddhist or becoming, anti-communist. No. Do what you can, when you can, where you can, how you can. And I found, as someone who benefited immensely from studying the philosophy of theosophy, and doing so in concert with others, where we breathe together, conspire together to learn. And when we were doing that and raised questions and challenged our thinking, we brought a fresh element to our lodge meetings, because it's about jnana, knowledge, but it's also about bhakti, devotion, and it's also for the sake of righteous, honorable, helpful action. So our lodge is a center, all of them, potentially, of spiritual learning and of emanating spiritual effluxes that uplift and help others. That's why I reference, when people come to lodge meetings, if all of us remember, it's not a meeting, it's a gathering of souls who've before been involved in history over millions of years in efforts to gain wisdom and embody compassion. And if we come together with that attitude, we sanctify. We do what Thomas Paine said in America: every man and woman's mind is its own church. The cathedral is inside. And if we have the right attitude when we come to our meetings, you can count on it. There will be a wonderful efflux, a current that comes and touches everyone in the lodge who's open-minded, open-hearted. And then magic occurs. The mind goes through a refinement. Deeper aspects of the heart are summoned and awakened. And we will find that words that seem to us to be something we've heard so many times will suddenly become infused and suffused by a spirit that had been missing. And then things have a wonderful meaning. And there's no such things as two identical meetings. You can hear the same philosophy a million times, but it can be a million times fresh, because wisdom is infinite in its potential. The meanings, the freshness, the originality, the therapeutic value of it is immeasurable. And so it's my hope, and from what I've learned, and I've seen it with so many others who've come and spoken to you as well, Kirk and Michelle and others, but this notion of reconsecrating our lodges and thinking of them once again, not just of people coming together just for a lecture, but coming together, breathing together for the good. And we connect then, as Socrates said about love, that attitude invites the attention of the gods, of those intelligent, creative forces that look to infuse and suffuse and breathe into mankind. That will help it gain wisdom on this long, vast evolutionary journey.
Thank you, Jim. I had one other question from the board.
Yes,
Sorry, this one. There are two questions here, really, which have bothered me since I was a teenager. What is the purpose of it all, and what is God's? Now, when I have read about Buddhism, there is no gods, but you speak of gods. What is God's? What is the purpose of it? All of it.
Okay. Well, you've to ask what's the purpose of it all. I can, and what is God? Well, that's a question for about 100,000 lifetimes, but I'll make a go of it. Shankara was asked, how long does it take to become a fully enlightened human being? Apparently his answer was about 100,000 lives. Now, what's the purpose of it all? The Dalai Lama was asked that same question. He says, I can't tell you what the purpose of the universe is, but I can tell you there's suffering and that there's enlightenment. And when enlightenment comes, it doesn't just light you up, it lights everything up. And you're able then to see the depth of human joy when it reunites itself with the transcendent God. You can call it anything. I mean, the word God has been tarnished by its misuse for a long time. But the notion of a unified consciousness in a vesture that is divinely pellucid and transparent and translucent and radiant and incandescent, my heavens, to experience that and to see that the joy comes, the true joy comes in helping other people in whatever simple way. When someone does something decent for someone else as a deliberate, intentional act, you can rest assured that it has a creative, healing potency that helps that human being in unknown ways. And it also helps you as well. And that dissolves in time the boundaries of personality, such that we can, in an instant, put ourselves in the place of another person. And by doing so, we reduce the number of lives of ourselves and others in which we go without wisdom. To put it differently, the boundaries of, as we dissolve the boundaries of personal selfhood, we emerge into deeper and deeper levels of divine consciousness, if you wish to put it that way. And that is so, as Shankara says someplace, to the enlightened, the joys that come are perpetual and ever-changing. They're indescribable to mention. But at the same time, if you in the right training on the Bodhisattva path, your entire being wishes to share that joy with every living, suffering creature, whether human or animal. It doesn't matter. They are so suffused and permeated by compassion because they know they're one and everyone else is one. We're not only in the all, we are the all. Each one is the all. That's Plotinus' teaching. Every single human being, all is an all, and each is also an all. That's a phenomenal idea. It's the greatest concept of God you can have. Sorry, I hope it didn't sound like I was preaching, but I get impassioned over something like this.
Thank you, Jim. We're going to take one last question.
All right.
So I have a little story here for you. Can you hear me?
Yes, uh-huh.
So there's a gentleman that goes to a Buddhist monk, and he asks the monk, "Can you tell me what is God? Who is God?"
Uh-huh.
The monk sat for a little, and he said to the gentleman, "Go home, look in the mirror, and ask the mirror, 'Who are you?'" The gentleman went home, looked in the mirror, and he didn't need to ask the question.
Ah. Yes. I see the point. But that's
Okay.
also, yeah, that's also, that's tricky. I hear people say, well, you know, you're God and I'm God and he's God and she's God. Yes, that's metaphysically speaking true. But to realize it in one's consciousness is by degrees and through effort and through making mistakes and through self-correction and through suffering and through sympathy for other people and their suffering. Then we begin to realize the sense in which we are existentially speaking God. It's an evolution, folks, right? It's not something instantaneous. Remember, Jared, I know you're all by your, I'm going to tell you one quick story about time and time. Can I tell you just a quick story from the Hindu tradition?
Thank you.
Yes. Two Shaivites, followers of Shiva, are meditating in the forest. They're deeply devoted. Well, one night, to the first of the two Shaivites, suddenly this devotee senses a light and feels a glowing presence. And he opens his mind from his meditation and he sees before him the luminous figure of Shiva. And he bows. He's so grateful to have a vision, a darshan of Shiva. And Shiva speaks to him. And Shiva says, if you continue your devotion, in only 10 lives, you will surely attain nirvana. And the devotee says, 10 lives? And Shiva said, make that 1,000. And then he goes to the second devotee, who he in turn has this incredible darshan. He's been a devotee for decades in the forest. And Krishna in turn speaks to him. If you remain true and devoted, in only 1,000 lives, you will surely reach nirvana. And this devotee says, oh, only 1,000 lives. And Shiva says, make that 10. Interesting, isn't it? Our perspective has a lot to do, and our attitude, with our spiritual altitude and our sense of sensing this innate, implicit divine in every human heart.